Sergio, good to see you.
How are you, sir?
I'm good. I'm good. As you know, I love it when you call me sir. I feel like, hierarchy is being
Yes,
reasserted, and there's
what's the habit?
no anarchical potential here. Um, I want to say hi to you. I want to say hi to anybody who's able to join us tonight.
Mhm.
I am very excited to talk to you about your play, about more about anarchism in general and its influence in world affairs, but also about how it connects to the kinds of things that you're writing, kinds of things you're interested in. And folks should know that this play is going to be broadcast. I've heard it. I am one of the lucky few who has actually heard it in advance, and I highly recommend it. But it will be broadcast Wednesday, October 27th on the Parsnip ship's broadcast media. Yes, I think that's right.
Yeah, the Facebook.
Very. I think people are really going to be into it.
Yeah,
I
Facebook
really
Live
like it.
will be presented on the Parsnip Ship's Facebook page. Yeah.
Yeah, that's great. So we haven't had a chance to talk much, but I think Ivan was possibly interested in getting us together because I'm very interested in radical movements and revolutionary movements, and particularly kind of some of the stuff that you're talking about. Some people who are seeking liberation from authoritarian states. I spent a lot of time in Eastern Europe when the Berlin Wall was coming down, and a lot of the democratic activists in Central Europe were artists and playwrights, and they made all sorts of interesting connections between the things they were writing and the kind of free society they imagined after the collapse of the totalitarian state. And most recently, I was in Hong Kong interviewing people who were protesting against the Chinese government's control of the city and their sort of encroachment on the liberties of the city and the freedom of the city. And some of those people are, real anarchists. I mean, or at least very committed to taking whatever means is necessary to push the Chinese state back. They're in exile now. I mean, they're in serious trouble now. But they were engaged in a real struggle for the kinds of freedoms you're talking about. And there's this very interesting connection I wanted to tell you about. Between, I think, I mean, I know you're perfectly aware of this, but the sort of freedoms of living without the restraints of an overweening state, and artistic freedom to create what you want to create, to make the artistic communities that you want to form. The guy that I loved so much in Eastern Europe, the guy who ended up as actually president of Czechoslovakia, who led the dissident movement there, was a playwright, Václav Havel. And he wrote a lot about the connections between true spontaneous life and artistic freedom and artistic liberty. That, the problem with the communist state wasn't just that it was totally authoritarian, but it was boring and it was kitschy. And it clamped down on all the spontaneity of real life, and twisted anyone's attempt to do an original artistic thing into kitsch and ideology. And this didn't really come up in your play, but I'm wondering if you see if you're interested in these connections, if you see a kind of connection between artistic freedoms and political freedoms, and how you feel as a creator. Do you feel like you're making something spontaneous and original happen? Is that part of the pleasure of it? Does that feel political? I'm just curious about that.
Well, I think art is always at its best during periods of social uprisings. I think that's usually when artists are working the best because so much is at stake. It's why I think I was always attracted more to political theater, political storytelling, because it's always a lot that's going on, and always like very heavy circumstances. Like in Clifford Odets, Waiting for Lefty was like, if these characters don't get what they want, they will die.
Mhm.
That's sort of the
Okay.
stakes, and I always think that's the more exciting type of storytelling in theater. However, I should make clear as well, though, that I don't think an artist necessarily is inherently required to make political art.
Mhm.
I think an artist is free to do whatever they want,
Mhm.
and they shouldn't necessarily be restricted by ideologies, whether it's their own or whether it's the states or whether it's their faction of friends. There is a responsibility I think artists have to themselves,
Mhm.
and I think it's to tell the truth, their version of the truth. So I don't think that's necessary. So they have necessarily an obligation to make ideological art. However, I will also say that art for art's sake, in my opinion, is also pretty boring
Mhm.
and pretty self-indulgent and masturbatory. And I think it's very telling that so many artists make art for art's sake, or make art for for whatever reason they can't even like really articulate, because they just want to have some gain some sort of notoriety around a type of aesthetic.
Mhm.
And
Oh,
I
I see. Yeah, yeah.
Yeah, and I think the aesthetic itself is problematic when it's sort of rooted in that sort of capitalist idea, when it's really just about trying to gain profit from an artistic idea, as opposed to actually commenting on the society
Mm.
or questioning the society in which you live.
Mhm.
Because I'm unaware of any society that I've ever heard of or read about that was ideologically or perfect or anything, and everything was fine. I've never heard of that. There's always been issues to talk about and discuss, and to further ourselves in terms of the uh, kind of human evolution with regards to the character of humanity. And I don't necessarily think that making art for, I mean, art was being done, I think, like 100,000 years before the invention of language. So it's something that is really inherent in humans to make and to create. I think
Mhm.
it's a fundamental part of human nature. But that doesn't necessarily mean that every art piece I have to agree with ideologically.
Mhm.
I work at the public theater, for example. There was a Cuban theater that came there, and I thought it was really brilliantly done. I didn't agree with the politics of it, though.
Mhm.
It To me, it turned out to be sort of like oddly anti-revolutionary, and I was like, well, this is kind of strange. But that doesn't mean it didn't deserve to be there.
Mhm. Mhm. Mhm.
You know what I
Mhm.
mean? So
Yeah.
it's, like my own ideological bias is not really necessarily important.
Yeah.
But I will call it out and say it's boring or not interesting, or I think yeah, is Andy Warhol eating a hamburger on film considered art? Sure,
I
it's
think.
dumb, it's boring, but yeah,
Yeah.
I guess that is art.
Yeah, but I think that's really interesting what you say about this sort of connection between um, a capitalist style demand for attention or for share of the marketplace,
Mm,
and kind of shallow originality in aesthetics, like that you can do something flashy and get
mm,
everybody's attention, and it's a piece that doesn't actually speak to anything, or doesn't actually engage with society or address anything. No,
mm,
what I meant by the politics of it is not necessarily your own individual politics, but that when you are writing, uh, you are engaged in exactly the kind of freedom that you'd like other people to be able to apply to their own lives. That you're creating something spontaneously, you're generating something that didn't exist before. You're involving collaborators. You're enjoying the kind of spontaneous life of that I think anarchists imagined could appear if only we could remove the repressive agents of our lives. That people could live more spontaneous, more creative, more imaginative lives if we could get the sort of kitsch and conformity out of our lives, and the oppression, out of our lives.
Yeah, I think it depends on the idea of how materials are distributed and how accessible they are. I mean, one of the things that I found being in the theater for as long as I have is that it's usually filled with people who are from the middle class and up. You very rarely see like genuine proletarian work unless it's coming from like a middle class person going to the proletariat and trying to make art from them. And that speaks everything, I think, to accessibility. And I also think that speaks to such a lack, there being kind of an unfortunate lack of Black, brown, indigenous art in the United States, and Asian art as well. I think there's a systemic idea of not only white supremacy, but of classism that is very much enforced in the American theater institution. I think it was George C. Wolfe said, if you're not telling my story, and you're not, or people of color stories, you're not really an American theater institution. American theater, you're a white supremacist cultural institution, and you should have a banner outside of your theater proclaiming so. Because that's the truth. It really is. And I never really understand why in a place like New York that there's such a lack of multiculturalism in our cultural institutions, especially in the theater. It just doesn't make any sense. This is, like I think 80 something, I forgot the statistic, but it's like the overwhelming majority of Broadway and off Broadway is quote unquote white. And I don't necessarily see how that is, culturally like right. It doesn't make sense, but it does make sense when you talk about the accessibility of those theater institutions, because it's geared toward rich white people and rich white ideology. It's geared toward liberalism that does not challenge any sort of systemic issues. And that's one of the issues I've have with liberalism in the arts, is that it really isn't seeking to change anything. It's really just kind of seeking to stop interruptions in the system that they have gained from.
So for you, then it's that issue of, what's the limit on the creativity here? What's the limit on other people being able to, produce this and enjoy this kind of spontaneity and enjoy this creative life and make art for themselves? The limit is resources. It's just it's the access to resources.
Yeah, I mean, because I live in Bushwick / Bed-Stuy, which people call Ocean Hill, but no one calls it that.
Is that one of those developers' names or real?
I couldn't. But one of the things that I've noticed is that art is not necessarily lacking within the masses or within the proletariat. I mean, if you walk around my neighborhood, you're going to see some brilliant graffiti. I mean, you'll see graffiti of one is of Alfred Hitchcock and Notorious B.I.G. Next to each other, and one has a cigar and the other one has a joint, and there's a pigeon on one and the birds, the crow on another of Hitchcock's cigars. So there's a lot of creativity like that. So it's not that the creativity is lacking within people. It's just a matter of whether they can really be seen as quote unquote legitimate. Because I think a lot of what happens is that art that comes from people of color tends to be seen as social activism as opposed to art, i.e. not European. And that is one of the things, I think, the notions we have to break at this point in history, because if we don't break that, then we're going to be stuck with the same dull theater we've had, and we're seeming to start to go back to that now that the movement is sort of losing steam. And I think it's an unfortunate byproduct of people not really having a connection to the arts in the way I think they should.
So what do you mean by people not having a connection to the arts? Like who's not having the connection, or who's?
Well, it's very rare to see poor Black, brown, and indigenous people go to the theater like every weekend. It's not that common. It's not really accessible when the tickets are over like $150.
Oh, of course.
People like I remember telling a family friend of mine. He was like, well, how much Broadway tickets are running now? And I said something, well, it's right now, I think the last show I was about $80. And he was like, and I think that was the cheapest. And he said, what? He just blew his mind. And so it's like, so like, a family of 4 is not going to be able to go to the theater. And even if they go to the theater, it's not guaranteed it's going to be good. That's one of the problems. They might as well stay home and watch, Netflix and watch Breaking Bad or The Squid Game, which are great shows.
No, exactly. I mean, I'm afraid that that's the choice for a lot of us is,
and so the essence of live theater doesn't really, doesn't seem immediate, which is one of the reasons I like working at the Bronx Zoo. I work at the educational department there, and we perform with puppets, trying to teach children about zoology and about animals and climate change and science. And because that's really lacking in America these days.
Mhm.
But it also, like, I've had so many people come up to me saying this is their first theater experience and they're in
Oh
love with
man,
it
yeah,
now. They
yeah.
love it. It's a dream for them. And I can't think, like, so many parents have come up to us at the Wildlife Theater Company at the Bronx Zoo and will say things like that to us,
Mhm.
that this is their first theater experience, or they have not seen live theater since the pandemic started. And it's a full aesthetic experience that
Mhm.
they will get.
Yep.
And I don't think a lot of people have that kind of connection to the arts in
No,
that
I
way.
mean, I think
I
that
think they should.
actually, a lot of anarchists have complained about TV. I mean, I love TV, but a lot of anarchists have complained about TV, that, TV is just part of the spectacle society, and it's sort of an inherently passive medium, and doesn't, when it's good, but it doesn't have the sense of immediacy, uh, and I don't know how to describe it, but the immediate connection, almost an incarnation of something genuinely new right in front of you, which is a different experience from watching a screen.
Yeah,
Uh,
I mean, we're in the third golden age of television, which is sort of ironic because it's weeding out television's relevance, because of all the
mm,
streaming services.
yeah,
So
yeah,
it's basically like TV on the internet.
yeah.
But what's also, if religion at one point was the opium of the masses, I think the internet has replaced it.
Oh, I
And
think very
and
much.
like Instagram or TikTok, whatever these new mediums are. And it's also kind of unfortunate, being a person who likes to tell stories, that people's attention spans have literally gone down to like 15 seconds.
Hmm,
And if you
hmm.
don't get your point across in 50 seconds, they move on.
Yeah, but
It,
also,
it,
just the sense that the sense that life is entirely digitized and
Mhm.
entirely, therefore entirely, under the control of, you know uh, forces, outside of your community, outside of your immediate neighborhood, outside of your immediate impact. I think maybe that's what I'm looking for. That the thing that my favorite artist dissident friends in Eastern Europe just loved about theater was that it woke people up because it was right in front of them, because they could do things on stage. They were very into absurdism. They could do things on stage that were absurdist, but that, as one of the critics at the time said, produced an electric shock in the audience, because they couldn't believe that a real human being was saying these incredibly critical things right in front of them, and
Mhm.
somehow very vulnerable, uh, and yet creating a kind of community of solidarity just by doing something so electric and dangerous right in front of them, not on the web, not on Twitter, not as a stalker or a troller or whatever you call it.
Well, that's
Uh,
why fascists have always targeted artists, because artists are a danger to the status quo.
mhm,
We can talk about people like Victor Hara, or Augusto Boal in Brazil. These artists were seen as threats to the state,
mhm,
and they had to be immediately repressed, and their institutions that they created dismantled,
mhm,
because they spoke out against the government. They spoke out against the authoritarianism that existed in their society.
mhm.
And one of the traits of fascism is disdain and persecution of artists and intellectuals.
But,
And
or no, I mean, hey, they've got their artists and intellectuals. They've got their own artists and intellectuals.
well, sure, but
There
they,
are
but I
artists.
guess of the left,
Yeah,
that
yeah.
who
There
don't
are artists
adhere
and
to the fascist
intellectuals that,
ideology. Yeah,
create worship of the state, and
yeah,
create
exactly. Yeah.
a kind of comfort with conformity, and mass obedience,
Mhm.
and a kind of celebration of it, which is, why, the anarchist, I think, is particularly dangerous as an artist, because the anarchist says, actually, we can do that right over here in our own neighborhood, and we'll be much happier than hanging out with you mobsters.
Mhm.
Um, well, my big hero, Václav Havel, this playwright, he was the hero of the underground stage. In fact, he had, I think it was at the Public. He had some of his first New York premieres at the Public,
Oh,
back before Czechoslovakia became
mhm.
very, very repressive. And then after the Soviets clamped down and he was kicked out, they were forced to do their plays in his backyard out in the countryside, or
Right. Yeah.
sometimes in an apartment if you thought you could get away with it, and write their own magazines for themselves.
Yeah.
And that became his ideology, that, hey, this is the kind of community we actually want the rest of the world to look like. People being able to create things for themselves, people being able to generate art where they are, find reflective meaning in their lives where they are, and free themselves from this kind of authoritarianism. Now, maybe that's a kind of opiate for the bohemians. I don't know. I mean, maybe that's just distracting themselves from the actual work of politics. But they felt like they were dismantling the state in their minds as they did it.
Yeah, I mean, for me personally, I would say that for example, like my parents, for example, were not artists in any way. I don't come from an artistic family at all, but I come from a very political family.
Mm-hmm.
So in a way, for me, it felt like the cost of my career in a way was like, yeah, you can go into the theater, you can go into the arts, but you have a responsibility to the masses or the people you are performing for to do more than just entertain them. Like I do, and I mean, I do consider education to be entertainment as well, but it's also to try and break people out of what you talked about in terms of conformist thinking or complicit thinking or going along with the herd. And I don't necessarily think liberation means you have to think like me.
Mm-hmm.
And I should be very clear about that. It's different for everybody.
Yeah.
And you'll just find factions of people who agree with you along the way, or mostly agree with you along the way. But there's not necessarily a responsibility until you take it on. And I have decided very early in my career that I wanted to take on, anti-fascism
Mm-hmm.
as being a priority for me, because I was being educated as a director in theater during the Bush administration, Bush 2.
Mm-hmm.
And I remember being very concerned about the fascistic implications that were being laid down and basically become the groundwork for the neo-police state that we have now.
Mm-hmm.
And that was very concerning to me. So I said, I'm going to dedicate my life to fighting that, because it is so oppressive and so
Mm-hmm.
awful and is leading to a lot of death. I mean, because when in a system this big, small gestures have major results. And it's what we're seeing now is the decay of the system, and that's basically obliterating a lot of people off this earth, whether they're in Iraq or Afghanistan or in Chicago or wherever. I mean,
Mm-hmm.
we're seeing the system now is a global system. We've never been in human history. We have not been in this position of where if the system fails, there's not another one to replace it.
Mm-hmm.
And we're also fighting very quickly climate change, which is going to make the planet unlivable for the species.
Mm-hmm.
And we have people who don't even believe it, who are in power, or who
Mm-hmm.
don't care about it, who are in power. So I think for me, like I feel compelled to talk about these issues when I write or when I make art, because if we don't do that, then I feel like I'm being complicit in humanity's own self-destruction, and
Mm-hmm.
I'm not interested in being a part of that.
Mm-hmm. I was going to say, it's clear that you actually want to reach people. If you don't mind me complimenting you on the sort of classical structure of your writing, because you're not selling, absurdism for absurdism's sake, are you? I mean, you're not doing, fancy, showy, sparkly little empty tricks. I mean, this is a
No,
classic.
and I think that comes from the background that I have in terms of Latino theater and
Uh-huh.
Chicano theater.
Yeah.
I mean, most of my parents are from El Salvador, so I'm Latino, but I
Okay.
studied Chicano theater with Jose Luis Valenzuela, and I performed for the Latino Theater Company as well.
Uh-huh.
And the history of Latino theater, and particularly Chicano theater, is inherently political. I mean,
Yeah.
that was about artists going into the fields, actors going into the fields, and telling people to join the union for peasants who were not
Right.
union, who were performing on the back of trucks like Brecht.
Yeah.
So that
Yeah.
was always kind of like the history of that has always been. And also I think in Latin America, when during places like Argentina and Chile in the 70s and 80s, where artists were brutally persecuted, the artists and playwrights had to figure out, well, how do we comment on fascism without getting our heads cut off. So what they would do is they would write plays about birds, about one bird who comes and frees this other bird from the cage, and the cat is trying to get to it, and they had to fly over to this other place where there was no cage, and they'd be questioned by the police. Is this about, is this about communism? They'd be like, no, it's about birds. What are you talking
Only if
about?
you
um,
see something here? Is there
yeah,
something you want to tell me, Mr. Police Officer?
yeah. It's I mean, in magical realism, it's a little easy to brand magical realism onto Latino playwrights, although a lot of us, to some extent, are very influenced by it. And I think that's something that I consider in my own writing. But for this play, for Radical specifically, I didn't want to put any of the gimmicky or like magical whatever into it, because it's like, no, this is a conversation about now. This is a conversation about this issue. This is about fascism and fighting fascism. How do we do that? And I don't want people to be distracted by theatrical gimmicks, as useful and great as they may be. I didn't want it for this play.
No, I think, and I think that it's really the triumph of the message over the medium. I mean, you've got something you really want to say, and you want people to just listen. I mean, just and give them characters that they want to pay attention to, and give them debates that flesh out the discussion in interesting ways that are not just one-sided. That isn't. I mean, this is in no way a sort of thudding, propaganda piece. It's this really intricate conversation, and I think beautifully done in a way that gives characters arcs that are interesting, or gives one of the main characters a very particularly interesting arc, and but it's classic. It's not kind of absurdist or a spectacle. It's very beautifully crafted, and really a nice piece that gets its points across. I wanted to ask you about the police because I've been thinking a lot about the stuff that you're dealing with the police, and what you were just talking about with militarization, and anarchists' relationship to the police, the concern about the police, the militarization of the American police, which freaks people out across the political spectrum. Actually, that freaks out a lot of sort of traditional conservatives too. How authoritarian policing has become, which is not what it's supposed to be. And so I wanted to ask you about your idea about policing and its relationship to anarchism. Where you see how does anarchism help us undo this militarization of the police? How does it help us reimagine the police?
Well, I'll take a concrete example. If we're talking about a place, say, like Rojava in northern Syria right now, that's being created by the Kurdistan, historical Kurdistan, that's creating by Kurds and is being led by women. One of the aspects, I'm not sure if they're still doing it, but when they were still kind of a small autonomous territory, anybody who came in there had to go through 6 weeks of training in terms of being a soldier and being educated under Abdullah Öcalan's ideology and history of the world. And I think that was actually really kind of brilliant to do, because if everyone's a cop, they're not needed. If everyone learns how to de-escalate a situation or learns how to use a gun, and it's kind of hard to pick on people who have guns. It's hard to pick on women who have guns. It's so I think there's a sense of reimagining what community itself looks like. I mean, the slogan is "Strong communities make police obsolete," and I think that's true. But it also depends on what kind of, again, where resources are being distributed. And what I think is that if we distribute resources more responsibly, we can weed out the police very easily. Because police don't actually stop crimes. They come after it's done, or they perpetuate the crimes, or they turn something into a crime, or they hide their own crimes because they work like the mafia. There is a loyalty that they have to one another that goes beyond the bounds of morality and good taste. So it's when we talk about abolishing the police, it's really about trying to reimagine how a society can function without authoritarianism that isn't justified. Because I think that's one of the principles of anarchism, is that if there is hierarchy in a situation or in an institution, unless it can be justified, it has to be dismantled. And what we believe is that the police are really agents, or maybe perhaps more like dogs of the state. And what we don't like is that them imposing the values or the ideas or the reinforcements and the laws of the state that we don't feel that they have any authority over us to tell us how to
Mhm.
live.
Mhm. Mhm.
And that's one of the things I think we can start to reimagine about what it is to educate a society in a certain way, what it means to aid a society in a certain way. Because again, if people are trained to take care of themselves, there's going to be a lot less likely problems of the kind of problems we're seeing with policing today and always have. I mean, this is a policing that came out from slave patrols. I mean, this is what the evolution of that institution, and there's no real reason I think that shouldn't be dismantled because it doesn't really justify itself in any way that I'm aware of. Um,
Mhm.
that can't be that issues that can't be resolved by the community itself.
Mhm. Well,
So
but yeah. Mhm. Mhm.
yeah, because I mean, one of the people who say like defund the police, for example, say things like, "Well, what one of the issues is that police come from not those communities into other communities where they don't know anybody and they don't really have any idea about what's going on.
Mhm.
So
Mhm.
what they want to change is that they want policing, to whatever extent it exists, to come from within the own community,
Mhm.
its own
Yep.
community,
Yeah. Yeah.
which is a better idea, I think. But at the same time, we also don't want authoritarians, around wherever they are.
Yeah. But
So,
no. But if
but that would be a tool in dismantling the kind of this institution that people are against.
Mhm. No, I mean, I think that I really like this emphasis on the policing in whatever form it takes, coming from the community itself,
Mhm.
because I think that not all policing obviously comes from slave patrols. I mean, there is a
Well, in the
tradition.
United States, it does.
Well, not all of it. I mean, so in New England, it comes from the Puritan traditions of organizing community, maintenance of the community, and the more liberal wing of British society that
Mm,
put an emphasis on the police as being partners in the community, from the community,
mm,
in maintaining order. I mean, that's a big part of sort of Whig thinking, uh, and uh, and they draw the contrast. The 19th century British who were celebrating this model of policing were saying we're not an occupying army. The police are never an occupying army. That's
mm,
what makes us different from France. That's what makes us different from Prussia, where the police
mm,
come in from outside and stamp order on us. Our towns can manage their own affairs.
yeah,
And it's really interesting. I've just been digging into sort of the roots of this in Hong Kong because the police are a real problem in
yeah,
Hong Kong. And the problem has been how betrayed the Hong Kongers feel by their police, which the Hong Kong Police Department has its origins in the Chinese community of Hong Kong. I mean, the
mm,
Chinese community of Hong Kong, the British were basically there running trade in Hong Kong, but paid no attention to the actual Chinese community. And so the Chinese set up their own police force. I mean, they set up
mm,
their own community, maintenance of order according to their own culture. And the Hong Kong police force grew out of that. And it was always celebrated as our police. These
mhm,
are these are our people. And
mhm,
all of a sudden, 2019 comes along, and the Chinese state is cracking down on the autonomy of Hong Kong.
mhm,
And the police turn against the protesters, and everybody in Hong Kong is horrified. I mean, it becomes one of the major issues in Hong Kong
yeah,
is we trusted these people.
mhm,
These were our people, and now they've become part of the authoritarian state. Now they've become part of the state from above. And one
mhm,
of the things I love about your play and about the things that you're connecting to is, as you say, the sort of post-Iraq War militarization of the police.
mhm,
I live in the neighborhood where Jokar and the Zanaev brothers, after they bombed the marathon bombing, they drove right down our street here in our neighborhood,
oh, yeah,
and the police were out, chasing them, and they were looking for them for a couple of days. And good, I'm glad they were looking
yeah,
for
yeah,
them.
yeah,
But
sure.
it scared me what they were driving. I mean,
Mhm,
we were here in lockdown. We couldn't leave the house, and I look out my window and I see armored personnel carriers driving down the street. And my first reaction is, where the hell did that come from?
mhm,
Since when does the Boston Police Department have an armored personnel carrier?
yeah,
I mean, the stuff they brought out for this, chase of, two dangerous people, but two people.
mhm,
was astonishing, and the idea that that's ready to go in the background, was kind of creepy.
Yeah, I mean, for me, like, what was I remember during Occupy Wall Street, it was really disconcerting to hear Bloomberg refer to the NYPD as his own personal army.
I mean, what?
It was it's yeah. I mean, it's not only the militarization of the police, but it's also being celebrated by the state in such a way that it makes us, makes us on the left a little, disconcerted.
Of course,
uh,
of course. What do you mean by that? What do you mean? First off, what do you mean it's yours? And
yeah,
second, what do you mean by it's an army? To call the police an army is to totally misunderstand what the police do. And no, that's really disturbing. Actually, I wanted to tell you, because you talk about Occupy in the play and are interested in it, and it has these interesting roots back to David Gruber and the the sort of traditions of anarchism out of anthropology. The Hong Kongers were inspired by Occupy when they launched their own protests in 2014, and it essentially came to the same conclusions, that we need a self-governing society. We sort of need to restore the sovereignty of our community. And was had this immediate connection to what was going on Wall Street. And of course, Beijing is not going to listen to that. Enough of this self-governing business. No, I think the anarchist solution then for the police is this kind of reintegration of the police into the community, the roots in the community, to the extent that they agree, and the proper education of the population so that it's not as necessary.
So it's abolished in its current form.
Yeah. No, I think that's very, very interesting stuff and very well done in the play. I want to ask you also, I want to talk to you a little bit about tactics.
Sure.
The play, like I said, it's got this classic structure. It's also got sort of like a representation of classic anarchist dilemmas or classic anarchist questions. When do you use violence? When do you attack the police? What are you willing to risk physically, in these engagements with the police or with the military-industrial complex? And I think it's really gorgeous, and it's got a theatricality to it because, again, it's physical, it's present, it's bodily. You can imagine the risks the person is taking if you picture them as physical, engaged, present risks. But honestly, that's not what I think of when I think about anarchism these days and other tactics of anarchism. Because I think about Mr. Robot. I mean, I think about cyber hacking. I think about, where can anarchists actually take, the advantages of an asymmetric battlefield and use them. Like, if I go up against an armored personnel carrier, I'm going to get run over. If I organize my whole community to resist the police, or to co-opt the police, or bring them in, or do something, there's a chance. But if I take down their mainframe, they're done. Right. And I'm just wondering about your sense of the battlefield for anarchists today. How much room do you have for the kind of cyber anarchism? How much when you portray it in theater, I think it's boring. Like, I mean, Mr. Robot has the advantage of tight shots of Rami Malek's face. But and maybe I don't think it works in theater necessarily, the kind of cyber hacking. But I'm just wondering, in your own imaginations of the role of anarchist tactics,
Are you speaking about in with how it's displayed in the theater, or just in general? How
just like in general? If you put aside just talking about anarchism in general.
Well,
do you think
sure.
the future of anarchism is in cyberspace, or?
Well, first, I think it's important to establish what anarchism is not. It's not simply trying to destroy the state as it is in its present form
Right.
through violent tactics. I
Right.
think a lot of people confuse, and there's some YouTube videos that can prove the point that anarchists can be violent.
Yeah.
Um, so, but anarchism is also about creating community. I mean, one of
Hmm.
the things that I personally am confused by is that there's so much emphasis on the violence and weapons when in reality, like in a post-capitalist or post-industrial society, we're going to learn, we need to know how to grow food, we need to know how to
Right.
distribute that kind of food, we need to
Right.
know what people even if for me, and a lot of it really goes back to the Black Panther Party. A
Hmm.
lot of it for me is kind of like saying, well, the homeless need clothing. Well, let's give them
Hmm.
clothing. They
Yeah.
need food. Well, let's give the community food.
Yeah.
They need legal advice. Well, let's give them legal advice. They need transportation. Well, let's give them transportation. Like all these things that are or healthcare. They need healthcare. Well, let's give it to them. So there are a lot of things in those regards that I think anarchism is, in a way, much more important because we're
Hmm.
immediately addressing people's lives.
Hmm.
Dismantling or destroying the state right now is not really an option. I mean, it'd be nice, but it's not.
Hmm.
But so what we do is, I think we create free food kitchens. We create, places where people can sleep,
Hmm.
or because if you don't have a when you have a mattress, it's nothing. When you don't, that's all you think about, like what's going
Hmm.
to happen that night.
Hmm.
So, like, there are many things in terms of tactics on how we actually affect the community, and then we start to think bigger. Like, what can we do with more resources? What can we do if we had, more, if we had more collective power, like over these kind of situations? How many more people could we reach? And that's where revolutionary ideas start to trickle in terms of how do we do it.
Hmm.
And it's also a thing I think with cyber living in the cyber world now. Um, I don't know, to be honest. I think there's a sense of people spreading information, which is important in the information age.
Hmm.
But I also think a lot of that is drowned out when it becomes didactic.
Hmm.
So I
Hmm.
think you don't really reach people when you
Yeah.
kind of say this is what you should think.
Yeah.
I think it should be presented more as an option. Like, for example, again, the Black Panther Party, they said, and they kept it really simple. They said, these are our 10 points. This
Hmm.
is the 10-point program. This is what we want. It was
Hmm.
very simple. It was easy because if you hand Das Kapital to someone, they're not going to read it.
Hmm.
You know what I mean? We have to think realistically about how people operate these days.
Hmm.
So that's the thing. I think it's about engaging with the community on more than just one level. It is, and I see some good work that's happening. Like even here, a few blocks away from where I live, like every Wednesday or Sunday, people are in the streets picking up trash and just like
Hmm.
disposing that to make it a bit cleaner community where we
Hmm.
have less rats and we have less, it actually looks like a good, clean street.
Hmm.
Things like that really go a long way.
Hmm.
And I don't think you necessarily have to throw a Molotov cocktail to be an anarchist.
Hmm.
I mean, it really just depends on what you're dedicating yourself to, and what you're trying to. And because anarchism is not an abstract philosophy, it's a living practice.
Hmm.
That's one of the differences it has from Marxism, because Marxism, and I know a lot of Marxists who will talk about what society should be like and never lift a damn finger. They don't do a damn thing.
Absolutely. Absolutely.
Anarchism doesn't really work that way. You
Yep.
have to
Yep.
live what that practice. So if you really
Yeah.
believe in like equality, well, then you have to put that into practice.
Yep.
If you think women should be paid the same, well, then you put
Pay
that
them the
into
same.
practice.
Yeah.
If you believe that art should be political, you have to put that into practice. That there's not a lot of sitting back and doing nothing. It's just about actively getting into the community, actively addressing the things that you see as issues that plague the society in which you live.
I love that. I mean, I have to say, I think that's a really interesting answer, and it connects back to what we were talking about with theater, and versus Stranger Things, as great as Stranger Things is. Um, um,
It's
but, but
yeah,
but like
it's capitalist propaganda, but it's some of the best capitalist propaganda made in a while. I
I
will
told you
give it
it's
that.
80s nostalgia for me,
Yeah,
man.
it's a good show.
Yeah. But like the whole difference between theater that happens right in front of you and sort of sacralizes your own environment with a sense of the possible, and just watching something on a screen. I mean, I feel like too much fascination with the cyber techniques of anarchism. I mean, I think those people have the ultimate goal of bringing down corrupt states, and it can be extremely important. It's really important in Russia to gather information about Putin's corruption, and Alexei Navalny couldn't do what he's doing without his cyber hackers and his networks. Um, but uh, but I think you're absolutely right that the true spirit of anarchism is this same sense of the possibilities of life right in front of you, you know, and taking care of business right in front of you, and being active and engaged in the community right in front of you. So I
Yeah,
mean,
it's a form of egalitarianism. I
yeah,
mean, one of the things I think people also maybe not know is that, I mean, during the Industrial Revolution, like Americans were like working in factories, and they were talking about things like, well, like maybe the people in the factories who work in them should own them. Like maybe we should all get paid the same, and that any profit should come to everyone equally. Like, and they've never read European philosophers,
of course,
never read Marx.
yeah, yeah,
It's just sort of a natural sense of a part of our humanity that believes in solidarity and taking care of one another, and that's
mm-hmm,
the real spirit of anarchism. And I think again the tactics when technology evolves, so do tactics, and
mm-hmm,
that's one of the things we have to be very conscious of. But I do think a tactic like what Papas Fritas did in Chile, about in terms of canceling student debt, like by hacking into the system, is really brilliant. I was like,
mm-hmm.
fuck, great, I think that was great. Let's bring him up here. Um, but but that's like it'll take on different forms, and people have different talents, and
Mm-hmm.
we just have to sort of keep putting pressure on wherever we're talented. We keep pressuring that institution or that form or that tactic. Yeah.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm, mm-hmm. We have a little bit of that going on in a community where my wife and I were, until we had kids, very involved in the local theater in Chelsea, where the theater is dirt cheap. Chelsea, Massachusetts, is the sort of immigrant community just outside of Boston, heavily Hispanic. And a friend of ours runs a theater over there that has real deep roots in the local community. It's not fake, it's not uh, uh, sort of white savior grant writing fodder. It's actually a functioning theater that engages a lot of the kids in theater, as you say, sometimes for the first time. Um, but that's totally dependent on the local community. I mean, there's nothing happens at that place unless people are cleaning up the park before they do an outdoor production, or
Yeah, I mean the history of Latino theater is like that's pulling issues right out of the newspaper and like putting them on stage. And very much the way the group theater was in the United States, when Clifford Odets and Elia Kazan and like all these people who would later on become these legendary artists in the 20th century because of the
mm,
quote unquote method. But the group theater was dedicated to like a communist revolution. I mean, that's
mhm,
what Waiting for Lefty was about. That was what Clifford Odets wrote about until he narked on his comrades. But that's the thing. You have to dedicate yourself to something. It's what it's like the idea of like to tie yourself to a star and sail with it.
mhm, mhm,
Everyone has a certain idea of how the world should be, but I don't necessarily. They're always completely detached from what other people think it should be. Maybe the aesthetic is different, but like in the end, I think most people want to see everyone eat, have
mhm,
housing, have healthcare, have a clean water to drink, healthy food. It's not so divorced from what it means to be human. But I
mhm,
think in a sense of fascism or capitalism and imperialism, these are things that dismantle our forms of humanity that I
mhm,
think are inherent um, to us.
mhm, mhm. That reminds me of one of the last points that I had. I mean, obviously, if there's something you want to talk about, I don't have to ask all the questions, but I did have one other thing I want to talk about if I can,
Yeah, sure.
which is one of the things I love about your description of anarchism is the sort of inherent sense of human dignity in it.
Mhm.
That that this is a kind of engagement with your community that expects a certain amount of from everyone, that believes everyone has something to offer, that seeks to meet everyone's needs, and is founded on the idea of the dignity and autonomy and participation of the individuals, which I have to say has always driven me crazy about Marxism, because Marxism is all about, and forgive me because you use this word, and forgive me for criticizing the word, but Marxism is all about the masses, and the one thing the masses don't
Yeah,
do is
yeah,
be individuals. I mean, the proletariat will be, we will liberate them and they will have nothing to do with it. I mean,
yeah, right,
anarcho-syndicalism and Sorel and other people, talk about it with more of a sense of the spontaneity of the workers.
right,
But like, especially from Marx himself and from Lenin, I mean, you
right,
can see the authoritarianism in it a mile away. That they're
right,
they're 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 going to they're going to build a state for the people whether they like it or not.
right.
And I really like the alternative that you're offering.
Yeah, I mean, to be honest, I just like what happened in the Soviet Union had very little, if nothing, to do with socialism. I mean,
Well,
Lenin,
that's what people say.
yeah,
It had a lot to do with Marxism.
but yeah, I mean, but yeah, but they also dismantled, the Soviets within weeks. You know what I mean? Like, there was very little socialist revolutionary ideas behind it,
Yeah,
and it was they did it in the name of Marxism. They did it in the
yeah,
name of the workers. In reality, they just wanted to create a state where they tell people what to think. Well, that has nothing to do with socialism. That's actually the opposite of socialism.
yeah, yeah,
The only problem with the time was that you had the major manufacturing propaganda machines at the time saying that was socialism. The United States was saying what Stalin is doing and killing the masses and that's socialism. And then you also have the Soviet Union saying we are doing socialism, even though they were not practicing ideals written by Karl Marx. So the two propaganda machines were basically falsely saying that this was socialism. So it got tied to notions, whether you love it or hate it, to things that didn't really happen.
yeah,
So it's or are not socialism.
yeah.
But I guess for me, what I think about when I think of authoritarianism, it really is like, I I can't tell you how to live your life.
Yep,
You know what I mean? Like, that's not for me to say.
yep.
As long as you're not hurting anybody or oppressing anybody, then I think it's fine. Like, I don't particularly like religion, but if someone wants to go to a church every Sunday and worship something, whatever, it's not my business.
Mhm,
No, you do
mhm,
you. If you
mhm,
come over here and tell me I have to believe in this and that there'll be
yeah,
punishment, then there's an issue.
yeah, yeah, yeah,
Then that's an issue.
yeah, yeah.
But I guess like the what we see as the failure of authoritarian modes of resistance is something we have to take very seriously and learn from. And I think a lot of leftists today who are still within the Marxist community are very in love with the 20th century.
Oh,
And
interesting. That's
yeah,
so interesting.
and
Yeah, yeah,
haven't learned the lessons of the
yeah. No,
20th
I think
century.
that is really interesting.
Yeah, and
I feel that all the time. Yeah,
there's a lot of nostalgia and worship of like, and I remember I lived somewhere in what was it, Sunset Park once, and it was only one day, and I lived there for like 3 years, but there were Trotskyists were handing out newspapers,
yeah, yeah.
um, and I
How
and I,
adorable.
yeah, it was really cute. Um, I usually only see them at college universities, but I was like, oh,
Yeah.
you're here. That's interesting. Um, that's a new tactic for you guys, being with the proletariat. Um, but yeah, it's one of those things. And I straight up asked one of them, I said, okay, let me just ask you a question. Do you really think that, poor black and brown people care about a dead white man from 1917 who in Russia? Do you
Yeah,
think they care? That has nothing to do with their lives.
yeah.
It's this cultish idea, and whether it's that or what does the you know RCP or whatever. I mean, it's all this nostalgia for things that failed.
Yep.
And I think that is a very strange thing, because the left has this enormous capacity for self-destruction. And
Hmm.
I'm not interested in continuing that tradition. I
Hmm.
want to break it.
Yeah. Yeah.
I want this to be successful. I don't want anarchism to be a fringe. I want it to be mainstream. I want people to be looking at it on a massive level. But I think we need to have better, frankly, public relations and
Hmm.
better marketing about it, because
Hmm.
it's not just about, us putting on a hoodie and a mask and throwing a
Yep.
Molotov cocktail at
Yep.
the police. There's some of
Yep.
that in there. I mean,
Sure.
but it turns out, and this may be controversial to say, but anarchists are not that good at violence.
Hmm.
They're really not.
Yeah.
In the same of, like, Marxists are not very good at governing.
Yeah.
The only
Absolutely.
thing Marxists were really good at were manufacturing weapons. It seemed to be the only thing they were actually good
Hmm.
at least in the Soviet Union.
Hmm. Hmm.
But if we start to present it in a different way, market it in a different way, and come at it from, again, a communal point of view, as
Hmm.
opposed to saying, believe this or else,
Hmm.
or
Yep.
if you don't agree with us, you're an asshole.
Yeah.
That Those aren't tactics that work.
Yeah.
Like,
Yeah.
I
Nobody.
really
Nobody
do
likes that.
believe that kindness
Yep.
um, is something we should be taken very seriously.
Yep. Yep.
I think a lot of people kind of, like, dismiss that, but I really do think that, like, approachability and kindness, if we shout at them and yell at them and say you're wrong, you're an asshole, you're this, and accuse them and say they're stupid, they're not going to trust us. And
Of course.
frankly, they shouldn't.
No. Of course. Of course.
Absolutely, they shouldn't trust us.
Yeah. Can I tell you? Can I tell you like the most inspiring? When you said it feels very 20th century. I just want to tell you about something that I saw in Hong Kong that
Mhm.
felt so 21st century.
Oh, okay.
Okay, so picture this. I was talking to one of these organizers, and following our interview, we were going to go to join this rally called the Hong Kong Way. And what they were doing was they're basically building a human chain across the city,
I heard about that.
between the
Yeah.
city and China, roughly speaking. Uh, Now this was organized by practically no one. Uh,
Mhm.
it was created, I think, on a Reddit group. So people were pitching ideas to each other about what we want to do. Somebody found that this had happened in the Baltics 30 years ago. They said, let's try that. Okay, let's try that. And then people started, they set up a group within Telegram, I think, to to start to discuss how to do it, and everybody just jumped on board. And I don't know who was organizing it. I mean, that's kind of the point. You're not supposed to know who's
Right,
organizing it,
exactly. Oh,
but you could piece it together. It was so well done. We get on the subway, we don't know where we're going to get off because we're on our phones reading. Okay, here's a live Google Doc or Excel sheet showing how many people are at this subway station. Oops, better go to the next one, to make sure that that one fills up. And then, oops, better go to the next one. And the whole thing was ethereal and organized on the web, but had a presence in real life. This incredibly dramatic moment where you put 250,000 people together in a line across the city, uh, all with this kind of spontaneous organization.
mhm.
It was leaderless in a way that was very not 20th century.
Yeah.
There was no Lenin or Lenin type figure standing on a train, directing the masses to take over the parliament, take over the
Mm.
Duma.
Right,
It
right,
was it was literally the society rising up to make a statement. And that feels very 21st century, and it felt very anarchist in the way that you're describing.
that's really encouraging. Yeah. Yeah.
I think it can be done. I mean, I honestly think it can be done, and it will be the world will be a better place the more that gets engaged. Um, I think I warned you about the anarchy in my own household if I don't
Oh, yes, of
put my
course.
children to bed. But I want to thank Yvonne and Al and Todd for putting us together. And let's talk about when the play is. The play is
Yes, the play will be broadcast on Parsnip Ship's Facebook page on October 27th. Also, on my radio show, Al Parker will be joining me on Revolutionary Abolitionist Radio on Radio Free Brooklyn, which you can go to Radio Free Brooklyn's website and listen live. It's at 3 o'clock every Friday, 3 p.m. Eastern Standard Time. And I'm also, just to put my own stuff out there, I recently just did a play called A Revolutionary People's History of the United States for the NAACP, the North Carolina chapter. And I'm also trying to become a resident at the Signature Theater. Someone who's associated with Parsnip Ship might have some, leeway on that, some leverage, but, it's up here. So like I'm trying to definitely get myself out there in terms of spreading the message and of anarchism and solidarity and the workers uniting. So but thank you so much, Chandler. This was a wonderful discussion.
And I have to say, you have all sorts of interesting ideas, and damn, can you write? I mean, the structure, the elegance of I was so impressed. I really loved it.
Thank you so much. I appreciate that. It was really great talking to you. Take care. I hope you don't have a counter revolution with your kids.
I will put it down with force. No, I won't.
Take care.
See you later.